Okay, everyone. So I think we will we'll make a start. So I'd like to welcome Jim Wright to give the seminar today. So for those on Teams, welcome as well. Yeah, Jim's come all the way from Southampton to give the seminar, so we thank him for doing that, and he took the train just to make sure he was being as environmentally friendly as he could. So just for those who don't know Jim, he is a Professor of GIS and International Development at the School of Geography and Environmental Science at Southampton. He has long-standing interest in safe water access in sub-Saharan Africa, supported via various projects funded by the likes of the MRC, NERC and the Royal Society. I won't go through your full bio, because I'm sure you'll describe some of your work here, Jim. But yeah, we'd like to thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation. So.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Tony. So what I was going to do was speak about a bit of work that a collective of people have been doing. And in particular, I'm sort of interested around the interactions between water, sanitation and hygiene, and then solid waste management. So I'll be talking about some work that we've been doing in urban Ghana and Kenya. So before I go on, I should probably say I've done that usual trick of essentially taking pieces of other bits of work done by others, particularly some colleagues, Joseph Okoto in particular in Kenya, Lorna Okoto as well, Wuli Jojomenyo in Ghana, and some colleagues like Farouk Omar in Southampton. So I should really credit those people for a team effort. I'll provide a bit of background first of all. I use that word nexus, and I'm maybe just going to explain really why I use that word nexus in relation to WASH and then solid waste management in a municipal low middle income country setting. And then what I'll do is I'll sort of zoom in on one particular area, thinking about sort of measuring interconnections, particularly thinking about the mismanaged waste streams, if you like, that arise from behaviours such as disposable diaper use, packaged water consumption in these settings. And what I'll do is have a look at very broad level at three approaches to measuring those interconnections and then reflect back on them. So one approach involving household surveys, second approach involving environmental transit surveys, and then also Google Street View. And then at the end, maybe I'll reflect back on the idea of this nexus. So a little bit of background, first of all. These are some numbers that have come out of the UNICEF WHO joint monitoring programme looking at SDG 6 around universal safe water access. The y-axis is essentially the proportion of urban households who, as their main drinking water source, get it out of a bit of plastic. So if you look on the left-hand side there at Ghana, actually, if I was to update this, I used a slightly old slide, the majority of urban Ghanaians, if you ask them, get their water out of a bit of plastic. And in fact, that's not an unusual situation. If we went to the Republic of Laos, it would be similar. And actually, the kind of stuff that you see on that side is kind of similar. On the right, it's perhaps worth noting that there's quite a varied policy environment. If you were to think of Rwanda or Kenya, in East Africa, there are certain countries that maybe are kind of more stringent in terms of the policy environment when it comes to plastics. So you can kind of see when I say lifestyle behaviours, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. And you might ask where that consumption's taking place. I use the phrase a nexus of what water, sanitation and hygiene and waste management. To keep these cogs simple, I've left out the hygiene bit, but just to sort of give you ideas of what I was thinking of, I'd flagged up a couple of kind of behaviours, bottled water, sachet water. By sachet, I mean water sold in a bag, a plastic bag. They're examples of what you might call something that sits in between two of those cogs, the water one and the waste management one. And you can imagine downstream, you then have things like water treatment for microplastics, washing of plastic waste as well. I could carry on adding to that list. I mentioned single-use disposable diapers. If you were to think about service delivery chains, You've got people delivering water in one direction, people collecting waste in another direction. Arguably, there's some similarities maybe in the business models that you might see there. And I could go on adding more into that sort of set of interconnections. If I was to think of the communities that lack sanitation or lack solid waste, probably for a lot of people, the same communities that lack water, safe water, also lack waste services as well. So probably people are talking about the same neighbourhoods when they're thinking about kind of service delivery. So that's kind of the Nexus idea. And then I was going to focus in on those two bits around changing lifestyles and measuring them today. Maybe just to sort of say a little bit about why this might be important. If you look at the SDGs, the indicators, waste is under 11, water, sanitation, hygiene are under 6, a little bit disconnected. If you think about, not universally, but sometimes service delivery can get a bit fragmented. Similarly, perhaps also university curricula can sometimes separate out the waste from the other wash envelope. So simple idea, why not connect them back together again? I always feel a bit sort of, I don't know how to say it, really quite, it's quite challenging going out and measuring stuff without fixing it on the ground. So you might ask why kind of measure interconnections. A couple of things for me, measuring well maybe helps you to evaluate interventions, policy, programs, that kind of thing. So if we're able to sort of quantify those interconnections, it can help with monitoring and evaluation. And then maybe the other thing to say is we've certainly got some people from the packaged water industry on one of our steering committees. I think people realise in the industry that there are problems with their business model, and actually gathering evidence about the extent of that problem could potentially accelerate innovations within the sector. There's one up there, by the way, which is a sort of twistable water bottle, and then that enables people who lack crushing equipment to more readily collect more volumes of water bottles. So that's a sort of fairly recent attempt to try and fix a problem by the industry. So anyway, that's the sort of context of the background. Perhaps what I should do is kind of briefly say something about the project that brought the team together. It was one of a bit like the Spaces project here in Stirling. We were within the same portfolio, a project called Water and Waste, bringing a couple of bits of service delivery together. You might have spotted that the list of colleagues I mentioned, places like Ghana School of Public Health and the city of Kisumu in Western Kenya. Our consortium was also brought together through that programme. I should maybe say we had a pretty challenging time. We had a pandemic. We were threatened with our projects being terminated early at one point. I've been through 5 budgets and 5 project durations since we started, so it's not been an easy ride. But fortunately, at the moment, we've got an extension to enable us to maximise what we're up to. So that's the background to the project, and maybe now on to the sort of talk today. So really what I was interested in is the extent to which, to inform all the reasons we just said, the extent to which we can kind of quantify mismanaged waste arising from changing urban lifestyles, particularly among those who might be missing out on waste collection services. So what I'm going to do is just quickly rattle through maybe 3 high-level approaches to trying to understand those waste streams quite close to the point of consumption. So standing stock environmental transect surveys, Google Street View, and then finally household expenditure surveys. So I'll start maybe with the standing stock surveys and then kind of rattle through what we've done. So this is some work led by my Kenyan colleague, Joseph Okoto. So the standing stock surveys, essentially if you were to go and have a look at the beach cleanup literature, probably a lot of you are familiar with it already. You can find quite well established protocols for looking at waste on beaches from places like NOAA and UNEP. And actually, typically that involves either counting or collecting waste along a set of transects. So in this case, what we did was to adapt those protocols and have a go at implementing them in off-grid areas of the two cities of Greater Accra and Kisumu, a city in Kenya, third city on the shores of Lake Victoria. So our kind of particular take on it, adapting it to, in the midst of a pandemic, I should add, to that kind of environment, was to randomly select a set of enumeration areas that had slum characteristics, and then within each one generate a couple of transect lines, environmental transect lines, and then go along and count up waste every 50 meters along the transect line, scattered items of waste within a 2-meter radius alongside various other observations. We repeated that at different times of day. And then perhaps also the other key thing here is we weren't actually sure how well that would work given the realities of the environment of working in an off-grid neighbourhood. So what we did was to repeat that with 2 different observers doing the same thing. I should say maybe if you look at the guidance from places like the United Nations Environment Programme, they talk about plus or minus 20% on waste density measurements. So here's a quick kind of overview of our 2 cities. The little lines that you can see on those 2 charts are where the transects are. So you can see if we look at Kisumu in the left-hand panel there, that's Lake Victoria, the grey area. And then Kisumu's got a kind of central kind of built-up core, and then if you like a surrounding set of informal kind of badlands that loop round it, which you can kind of broadly see those transects lying in. And then over on the right, that's Accra, and actually this is a subset of Greater Accra, so we've got some transects also sitting in peri-urban areas that are more distant as well. So just to give you an idea, when I say that's not quite the same as a beach survey, that's an example of when I say it's not quite the same as a beach survey. So that's the kind of environment we're talking about walking through, trying to count up waste and apply the same method to. And that's without the sort of people in it and the curious bystanders. So if we were to sort of have a look at that and think about how well people do, a number of people here from a public health background, one of the fairly common ways of understanding how well people can repeat a set of observations is a thing called a Bland and Altman plot. On the x-axis, if you imagine walking along a transect measuring waste density, number of items per square meter, then that's the average of 2 different people's measurements on the x-axis. Whereas on the y-axis, what you're seeing is a percentage difference. So, and each of the dots represents a different transect, and this is a sort of pair of randomly allocated observers who've gone off and tried to look at the same thing round about the same time of day. So one of the things that you might notice is that there are a couple more things to take account of in that plot. The 2 lines that are furthest apart, the horizontal lines, they're what are called limits of agreement. So you can see actually they're very, very widely spread around those measurements. And the dotted line in the middle is, if you like, an estimate of bias. The further that moves away from the solid black line, the more potential there is for bias in the data. So in this case, you can kind of see very wide limits of agreement, kind of not a huge amount of, quite a lot of variation between what one person sees and the next, but overall the kind of bias is kind of quite low because that dotted line is very close to the horizontal thick black line that represents 0. So anyway, we kind of had a look, and actually if you think about the 20% that UNEP talk of as being standard for a beach survey, you can see the sort of precision of the observations is far, far less. We could have a look at a few more observers and see how they got on as well. These are all kind of pairs of Kenyan observers. Again, there's a sort of fairly similar picture there. Kind of not much precision, but not much bias. And again here, I should perhaps have added a little bit on the right-hand side, little hats, their confidence limits, so you can see they're kind of overlapping with the 0 line for pair 3. And we did have the odd pair, the occasional pair, such as this one, where it seems as though one person was maybe not picking up as much waste as the other one as they walked along the transect line. Notice the way the dotted line has moved away from the solid line. So that's kind of, if you like, how well we could go about measuring things. The other question is, what did we actually find out there? Here's some scattered plastic waste densities. For those of you familiar with the Clean Coast Index, actually the situation left-hand side, Kenya, that would be seen as pretty horrific. Ghana, somewhat better. So these are counts of plastic waste per square meter. So there's obviously a huge amount of waste there. Incidentally, it's perhaps worth adding that the two cities have rather different waste coverage. And one of the things that's very obvious in Ghana is in the past few years, very rapidly, an evolving plastic waste industry has very rapidly evolved to collect waste. So I'll skip over these slides a little bit, but plastic waste specifically, there's now some degree of waste separation and collection happening in Accra over that. Some other things I should flag. Notice the consumption figures right at the start. These are discarded items of plastic from packaged water in bags or bottles. You can see the situation in Accra looks quite a bit worse than that within Kisumu, counting those up. So again, we've got densities on the y-axis and then what are called violin plots, where the width of the plot reflects the frequency of the data on the graphics. One other thing actually came out really strongly, particularly in Kisumu, both in talking to people and through the observations, and that's these disposable diapers. In some cases, people trying to burn them and failing miserably in the middle there, but also those being kind of really prevalent in the environment. And actually, here's some equivalent figures around disposable diapers just kind of sitting in waste. Notice in Accra, the numbers seem much lower, but people tend to wrap them in plastic, and we couldn't actually get people to pick things up and count them. So that's perhaps a bit misleading. Okay, so I'm going to keep going and then do the kind of reflecting on the three methods at the far end. I'm now just going to move on and maybe think about, having spoken a little bit about what we might get out of attempting to measure things through field surveys, almost treating like the slum environment as though it was a beach. Maybe what we might do now is to maybe try a slightly different approach and maybe have a think about the potential of Google Street View to sort of measure mismanaged waste, particularly from these kind of streams and changing lifestyles that we're talking about in these environments. So Google Street View, I guess one of the things, if you were thinking of low and middle income countries particularly, is that the kind of penetration of Google Street View, not so much into the least developed countries, but into the lower middle income country bracket, is actually kind of expanding reasonably quickly. So you can kind of see, for example, metropolitan Accra and Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, that there's sort of street view coverage kind of emerging in all of those places. If we were to sort of head on a little bit further, if we were to zoom in on Kisumu, which has got kind of two rounds, if you like, of street view data collected for it, actually the kind of blue lines here tell us something about the distribution of the kind of street view imagery. So you can kind of see here the blue lines on that graphic would tell you where street view can be found. Actually, you can see that within the city, the kind of area around what's labelled as the Imperial Hotel Express, that kind of core has quite kind of dense street view coverage. And then if you were to head east and south to the badlands, if you like, of the more informal settlements, that the kind of coverage thins out rather. So if we were thinking about the kind of potential of Street View for kind of looking at characterising the waste environment, in high-income countries, if you go back the way, there's quite a rich tradition in the public health literature of using Street View images to measure things like neighbourhood disorder. And it's quite common for people within a construct like that to include components that involve the waste environment. So within things like graffiti, one might also look at the cleanliness of the environment. You can see in this context, however, what you might be interested in is maybe potentially using Street View in a slightly different way. So you might maybe be interested in seeing, looking at the nature of the waste that's lying about in the environment. And again, here you can kind of see, it would probably look a bit better if you're actually looking at it online. You can kind of see examples of packaged water kind of lurking in that particular image, for example. So, if we were to sort of head across to Street View, kind of one of the questions really would be whether or not what you see where there is coverage, if you imagine the kind of level of coverage within a city like Kisumu, is the waste environment around slums where there is Street View coverage, is that essentially more or less the same as all the back roads and side streets, which generally there isn't the commercial demand for the Street View image acquisition? Are there any kind of differences in the waste environment on and off Street View coverage, if you like? So if I was to zoom in a little bit on the kind of inset map that's lurking there, actually we ended up having some of our transects that sat along roads that did have Street View coverage, which is the kind of light yellow there, and others that did not. And so one of the things that we were able to do is, having done some field work, then what we could do is have a look and see whether there was any evidence of sort of spatial bias, if you like, in the in the waste counts that we observed on the ground. So I haven't done all of the kind of waste indicators here, but this might give you a bit of an idea. So in both cities, what we did was build a multi-level model and then look to see whether there's a fixed effect, if you like, at the higher transect level, with repeated observations on each transect, whether there was any evidence of an impact of Street View coverage impacting on observed waste densities. As far as we can tell, in both cities, on the whole, there wasn't. Although if you move to specific items of waste composition, notably personal protective equipment from the pandemic, actually there were some signals that that was a little bit higher along the kind of main roads where you tend to get more Street View coverage. Okay, so that's kind of, if you like, a bit of evidence emerging again about sort of measuring the interconnections via Street View. What I might do now, assuming I can get my, let me try again over here. Okay, that's got it. What we might do now is maybe move on to a third approach. So a third approach, which probably I suspect was the thing that actually was the most compelling to reviewers at the point where the project came through, was the idea of using household surveys to try and quantify mismanaged waste streams. And in particular, household expenditure surveys. So those of you from a more socioeconomic background might know the World Bank's Living Standards Measurement Survey series. So there are a series of surveys around the world that seek to measure household consumption. So let's do a kind of deep dive in just to sort of explain how those surveys work. This is from the Ghana Living Standards Survey. It's actually wave 7 of that survey, so there have been 6 preceding surveys to a broadly similar design. It's a nationally representative survey that samples thousands of households around the country, first sampling a set of enumeration areas, and then randomly picking households within those enumeration areas. As part of the survey, what happens is in the case of this particular survey, people are repeatedly questioned about what they spend their money on. And actually, one of the things that's maybe perhaps intriguing about it is that there are items like sachet water, mineral water, packaged water, all in there. And not only that, but also later on in the survey, people get asked about how, if at all, they dispose of their waste. So in other words, you've got kind of government data that indicates the kind of quantities of commodities that people are buying. So one of the things that a colleague of mine who now works for FCDO, going back a few years, we kind of realised that really there was some potential in this data. And so what we did was effectively to take a look at some of the data around packaged water consumption in multiple, several African countries. And then what we did was to, if you like, take the kind of quantities that people said they were consuming and then apply a set of conversion coefficients to them to then understand how much, if you like, waste that would generate based on people's responses. And then if you, because it's a nationally representative survey, if you add up those estimates and then break them out by the main mode of household waste collection, then what you end up with is an estimate of a specific good and the way in which it's entering the environment. So we managed to sort of do that in a number of countries using kind of packaged water as the idea. And then one of the things that we were, and then that ended up, and a successor paper, and both ended up in environmental research letters. And then what we wondered really through this project was the extent to which we could sort of push the envelope a little bit of that approach. So in our latest study, we had a bit of an experiment of kind of moving beyond packaged water and having a go at something else that lots of people consume regularly. In other words, cooking oil, that's a sort of ubiquitous good. So one of the things that we found really is that if you look at water in a kind of West African context, packaged water, essentially it's a really standardized good. You've got a water sachet, which is a bag of water that's pretty much always 500 millilitres. And then you've got a bag of sachets, a kind of multi-pack of 30 of them. And a little bit of lightweight market surveillance kind of essentially tells you that there are those two things. And if you head for the household survey, these are the sort of measurement units that are recorded in the Ghana Living Standard Survey Round 7. So if we have a look at them, you can see over here, essentially there's two synonyms, multi-pack and single, and then they're two bars, but essentially there's kind of two units in which it's sold. So it's quite easy to do that kind of conversion into amounts of plastic. If we look over here at cooking oils, it's kind of obvious that the picture is way, way more complicated. You can see things like Baltic bottles. Baltic's a brand of water. People are reusing the bottles to actually package up oils or measure them out. So actually you can kind of see that actually there's a far more kind of heterogeneous way in which cooking oils are sold in Ghana. So it seems as though a lot is to do with this approach as to sort of how standardized, if you like, the kind of packaging and sale of goods of a particular commodity actually is in terms of, I suppose, pushing the potential of household surveys as a means of measuring this consumption. One more thing I should probably briefly say, the conversion coefficients and tables themselves, we haven't got anything about plastic resin types in here, but sort of building on some work in the US, you could perhaps almost also ask yourself the question, how much plastic does it take to deliver a certain quantity of a good? So down at the bottom here, you've got sort of small purchases and large purchases. And then we've got container inefficiency, how much plastic is there per unit of stuff, if you like, to deliver that good. And what we've got here is some kind of literature review figures, and then some of our own market surveillance measurements. And it's perhaps noticeable in passing that you quite often see some lightweight forms of packaging, for example, oil sold in plastic bags, that you might not actually see in Europe or North America. I'm going to move on and just maybe push the kind of envelope of that approach a little bit more. You might have noticed we got a very strong demand from our steering committees and some of the municipalities to actually push on single-use disposable diapers. So the kind of active work for us right now is looking at the way in which single-use disposable diapers might be able to maybe even push on some of the multinationals that are behind the production of this, so that we can quantify the waste streams from them. The graphic in front of us gives you a bit of an idea. I've zoomed in on one survey in the work I've presented so far, but this is actually a system of surveys. There are hundreds of these surveys internationally, and they're repeated. And you might ask yourself about the extent to which they're suitable. So if we're having a look specifically at diapers, this gives you a bit of an idea about the country coverage of suitable questionnaire content around single-use disposable diapers. And effectively, you've kind of got a traffic light system there almost that kind of gives you, based on an audit, where you might find surveys that are of interest on diapers. I'll say a little bit more as well. We have kind of more or less managed to sort of successfully apply the same workflow to diapers. So this is the sort of Kenyan example you saw on the previous slide. So looking to see how much people claim they're spending and buying on diapers, then converting that across into quantities of nappies, trying to break that out. And then if we then break that out further, the households generally in these surveys also explain how they dispose of their waste. So then that gives us some sense, based on respondents' own answers, around just what the sort of volume of nappies might be that are ending up in waste streams like this, and where the consumption's happening among people that are maybe lacking waste services. There's some other things that are becoming apparent to us as well, and it's kind of nice to hear kind of Heather's Torrens just piped up right at just the right time with me talking about nappies. There are some other things that you can get out of these household expenditure surveys that maybe might not be apparent were you to start at the environment. My Kenyan colleagues would talk of something called the Kidogo economy. So Kidogo being the Kiswahili word for small. So in a household on a limited income, quite often what people will do is to try and smooth consumption so that rather than buying in bulk, given that people are managing day to day, they'll purchase small items on a daily basis as opposed to in bulk. So this is an example of the kind of things that you can get out of looking at household surveys. So what we've done here is to take some numbers, these are Ghanaian numbers actually, but some figures about bulk purchases versus single purchases of nappies. And then we've cross-tabulated that against what you might call wealth quintiles. So we've got national welfare quintiles, the one at the top, they're the poorest people, the one down the bottom, they're the wealthiest people. And if you have a look at the cells that are highlighted in bold, you'll notice that the kind of wealthiest couple of quintiles are generally buying in bulk, but then the penetration of that product into the population relies on people selling the nappies individually, because that makes it more affordable to the customer, in much the same way as when I was growing up. Actually, we had an inscrutable tobacconist who used to sell us cigarettes individually as school children. So it kind of gives you an idea that actually there are kind of business models that are Kidogo ones that enable you to maybe penetrate into the population a little bit more. I should maybe say we're actively working on other insights from household expenditure surveys as well. So, for example, trying to understand the way in which toilet training behaviours happen and how that might vary by socioeconomic status based on these income groups, which in turn then affects the waste stream. If we maybe pause there for a minute, I think what I'll maybe do in the kind of concluding bit of the talk really is again to sort of step back and then maybe have a look at those kind of three different approaches to trying to understand the interconnections between solid waste and mismanaged waste streams, and then the rapidly changing behaviours that might sort of generate quantities of mismanaged waste, particularly in that kind of lower middle income country tier. So maybe we should sort of start off reflecting back on the kind of first kind of block of first approach there, the idea of taking the kind of beach standing stock survey. So by standing stock, by the way, I mean the kind of amount of, if you think of a systems dynamic approach, it's the amount of waste that's sitting on the beach at the moment you land on it, or in this case, the slum neighbourhood. So if we sort of think of that approach, it's very well established in the kind of marine community, coastal community. If we were sort of having a look for actual evidence on how robustly people can kind of collect data in the real world, actually our kind of study here would suggest having independent observers repeat the same protocol, that actually the kind of ability of the precision of the method is quite low, but on the whole, generally the level of bias, you don't see systematic differences between different observers very often. And actually some of the sort of headline findings that I showed about the two different cities, we've experimented with looking at the impacts of swapping in and out observer identities on those estimates. And when it comes to city level averages, actually they don't make a huge amount of difference. So it seems as though that approach maybe has potential, but because of the wide limits of agreement, arguably you might need to collect more data to be able to, you may need to sort of have more transect observations in order to be able to make inferences from the data. And I think maybe we should perhaps also flag up, it's a pretty challenging environment. There are kind of difficulties of survey execution. There's community sensitization in those kind of environments is really challenging. In a few cases, we had problems of people cleaning up before us. In other places, we managed to do the community sensitization more successfully. And on top of that, there are very obvious surveyor health and safety concerns, even if it's not in the middle of a pandemic, which is why we didn't ask people to collect items of litter as they were going along. So there's some kind of reflections on the relative merits of the standing stock survey. If we turn to kind of Google Street View, obviously the potential of Google Street View is that it's scalable, it's repeatable, it's potentially amenable to automation. You could think of image processing, machine learning to understand kind of things like bottles and imagery. As far as we could tell, if you think of streets that are right next to an off-grid neighbourhood compared to being within the off-grid neighbourhood, we could see little difference in the kind of waste environment, the mismanaged waste environment on and off Street View coverage, leaving aside a few waste composition issues. In the interest of time, I didn't present this, but if you were to have a look at kind of dry season bias as well, there's no particular evidence for that. If we kind of stepped up a level, there's no particular evidence to suggest that's happening, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the coverage remains kind of highly variable and still kind of driven by a business need as opposed to a service delivery need. So it remains unequal, if you like, the coverage. And on top of that, actually, we'd only really queried the metadata for our paper, but had we gone in and actually tried to extract information from the imagery, then there are kind of issues around intellectual property and derived data products and so on. So there are kind of challenges to going down the Street View route too. And then finally, let's move on and have a think about a third approach, the household expenditure surveys. So you might have spotted the difference between the kind of oils and then the packaged water. Ghanaian sachet industry, really sort of standardized packaging makes it kind of well suited to the methodology. On top of that, I think you can kind of maybe gain a lot about consumer behavior from mining these data that are essentially already just sitting there waiting to be analysed. On top of that, the system's scalable and again, repeatable, it's nationally representative, it's a sort of existing system. And perhaps crucially, if you were thinking of policy and a national government, it's a politically acceptable data stream because you're using a government's own data in which to inform their policy. That said, there is rather a lot of questions that it raises as well on the other side. Particularly thinking about cooking oils, we had to make some pretty heroic assumptions when it came to converting from packaging into amounts of waste. Much the same thing happens, by the way, if you were thinking of the nutritional content of things like the food that people eat. If you were thinking about calories, for example, a lot of public health and nutrition people face the same issues. There are other problems too, things like the categories of how people have their waste collected. Relative to my background, which is mostly in water and sanitation, they're not very well harmonised categories, meaning that there's a lot of country-to-country variation. On top of that, sometimes you find that the commodity codes that are used in those kind of surveys quite often tend to follow almost like the HS codes that you might put on a bit of paperwork for a courier. So you can kind of see, and on top of that, perhaps to add, these surveys, unlike demographic and health surveys that some of you may know, the geographic representation is scarcer that you find GPS coordinates being released for groups of households. So you can kind of see that I hope that we've provided some evidence around sort of interconnections between emerging kind of water and sanitation behaviours and the waste streams that they generate. There are certainly challenges of measurement, but it seems to us, meaning not just me and the group in Southampton, but people in Ghana and Kenya as well, as though based on what we've sort of seen in the two cities, that actually there are a huge amount of interconnections between wash, water, sanitation and hygiene, and solid waste. And one of the things that I was really interested in doing here, in hearing about the Spaces project and maybe some of the experiences of other people in the room, is whether that's kind of unique to the cities that we've been working in, or whether that's something that kind of resonates with other people as well. So I sort of feel as though we're seeing an awful lot of interconnections between wash and waste, but I'd maybe actually be really keen to hear from everyone else if they're seeing the same stuff. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, we'll open it up for questions. So we've got about kind of 12 minutes or so for questions. So yeah, I'll give privilege to those in the room that have made it today. If you have any questions, again, those on Teams, if you want to post something on the chat, or you can raise your hand, and I'll try and get to you as well. So anyone in the room got a question?
Oh, hang on, there's a hand.
Oh, yeah.
I'll get my question in before the meltdown begins. So it was really interesting to see the kind of the spatial distribution of waste. I wondered if you did any work, and I might have missed this when I was doing that, or had any sense of how things changed over time in terms of waste. Because thinking of the Spaces project, that's something that's sort of got my interest as well, is, you know, through the burning of waste or the removal of waste piles and things, what kind of temporal changes do you see?
That's really interesting. So I should explain that we're kind of at the point of having a large amount of data, but not having got as much out of it as we could have done, given the history of the project and the pandemic and having our budget played around with, etc. So we're really keen to analyse change over time in the standing stocks of waste. And if I was to, and we've got somebody involved in the consortium who is essentially a government waste practitioner, and I would hypothesise in Ghana especially that we'd see greater absolute values of waste flux for certain types of plastic that have value. So those would be PET bottles, clear HDPE or LDPE plastics, but not coloured ones, and then what a Ghanaian would call a gallon, which is essentially a kind of a large HDPE container. So they all have some value. I'd probably expect the clear LDPE, HDPE, especially water sachet wrappers, to have the greatest flux. So I'd expect people to be running about picking them up. But we don't know the answer to that yet. Somebody in Ghana is actively plugging away, looking at that.
Well, that's brilliant. There will be some data. Okay.
Any other questions, Drew? Jeff?
Okay, this isn't really a question. I wanted to answer your question that's on the board there. So I am working also on a GCRM project. It's just come to an end actually in Cape Town.
All right.
And, we're looking at, it's called Water and Fire as a short name, but it's essentially looking at how township communities, both formal and informal, are impacted by fire, drought, and flooding. And waste and sort of wash issues have been a huge part of the project. That the waste side we didn't necessarily go in looking for, but nappies in particular are blocking drainage systems.
Right.
We're working in communities where the water table is very close to the surface. Things are getting clogged up and causing really quite severe public health issues. So although it's still in the sub-Saharan Africa kind of context, there are other cities and places that are certainly impacted, and we'd be happy to talk to you more about that.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's really kind of useful to hear. Actually, I should probably very briefly add the kind of flood-prone, kind of high water table thing would apply. I think that's certainly in Kisumu that would apply. The kind of Badlands belt is essentially old wetland that people have started living on. So the kind of the public health consequences of mismanaged waste and the potential for increased flood risk would be the same as well.
We found a lot of tension actually around who's responsible and who should be doing things about waste collection, both in the communities themselves and sort of the city level. And there's certainly in Cape Town there's all sorts of weird and wonderful policies that mean that some parts are much worse affected than others. But yes, the kind of the political agenda seems to be quite important in this context as well.
Any other questions either from teams or in the room? Well, I have one. I suppose this one gets with the Spaces project and people involved in the Spaces project here. But
yeah.
For one, Ebenezer, you got a question?
Yeah. I would like to know from the presenter what are the plans of the government in general to deal with the issue.
That's a good question. So at the moment, if one of the things that the Ghanaian government's done is it used to, if you go back through the policy environment around people consuming plastics, if you go back through time, there was talk of banning sachets at one point, even though the evidence is that they have a massively protective effect against fecal contamination of water relative to piped water. So at one point there was talk of a ban if you went back about 10 years, but then that was rescinded. The government then effectively charged a much higher tariff for those packaged water producers who were essentially packaging up tap water. So the tariff that they paid was increased by a factor of 5, going back about 8 years ago. And then currently, at the moment, the Ghanaian government has introduced a sort of sales tax, a levy on plastics. So there's some attempt, a little bit of attempt to sort of moderate consumption of plastics. And at municipal level, there's quite a strong push to support the industry that the plastic waste recycling industry and education initiatives that go through it. So I guess that's a sort of potted summary, at least on the Ghana side.
Right. Sydney, I think on Teams you mentioned you had a few thoughts or questions. I don't know if you're able to put your mic on or not.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting, Jim. Actually, I had a couple things that struck me as you were speaking, especially about this, this conversion from consumption to waste assumptions that are made in the household expenditure surveys. And I was just thinking about, like, even in the graphs that you showed that had like the water, the different types of water containers on one side and then the cooking oil ones on the other side. Even within there, you have this internal interconnection almost, where you have water bottles being converted to use for cooking oil and not necessarily entering the environment directly. And this might have something to do with what Heather was mentioning as well. I couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but there's a different value in all of these things that mean that maybe they're being used multiple times before they go back into the environment. So there's a lag between. And I just wondered, like, if there's something around that you've looked at. Even different types of plastic bags will be used over and over again in my experience in Malawi versus other types of plastic films. So they're used for waterproofing things. They'll be used to actually be burned in a different way, not as garbage, but as fire starter often. And these are things that are seen as valuable at household level. So there's that. And I'll just, on a completely, not a completely different note, but the second thing I was thinking about, just to put it out there, is around almost like a national pride level Hawthorne effect that might be something to look out for if something like Google Street View was used on a more global scale as a monitoring and evaluation tool for comparison between countries. Because I think for the same reason you were mentioning, like, I remember something that happened in Malawi not too long ago, where when the indicators for household water access changed with the SDGs, the government was very hesitant to adopt those new indicators because it would make them look bad.
Yeah.
And there's the thing with the Google Street View, possibly aside even from different levels of coverage in different countries, but also that Street View only covers a certain, it only covers the areas around the streets. And so if you know that, and you know that's being used as the way of monitoring and evaluating, you as a country, you might just make sure that the streets are cleaned, and all that's about, 50 meters away from where the cameras are taking photos. So I don't know, I'm just, these are the things that came to mind for me, but I think it's really interesting work that you're doing, so thank you. I
might maybe just respond to one comment, which was around kind of container reuse and recycling. If I think back the way, I'm kind of getting quite old now, to be honest, and going back the way on the kind of water side, there never used to be questions about household water treatment in the home. People boiling their water or adding chlorine in or using filters. And then after a push, eventually people managed to get that question in. And then that essentially kind of almost rewards people who've effectively promoted that behaviour, or populations that are practicing it widely when it comes to SDG monitoring. Quite often with household surveys, there's an opportunity you might be able to lobby for like one extra question, And for me, the one extra question would probably be something to do with domestic waste separation. So the stuff that's getting separated, it will only work if it's got some value. And at the moment, it seems to me a bit like where we were with household surveys and water when I used to have hair. And I kind of wonder whether sort of the solid waste collection questions in surveys almost need a bit of love and care in the same way that water, sanitation and hygiene have had over the last 10 years. And maybe having, do you separate your waste or secondary waste disposal could really help with that.
Any other questions? Either teams out in the room? I thought, okay, one, again, you can maybe speak afterwards, I thought I had, but I was kind of wondering about when you're doing this survey work, the sort of transect work, what about like kind of depth within these, kind of like sort of 3D of the waste, within those kind of audits that you're doing, is it essentially a surface scan? Because you said you can't let people go in and root around and really look at it in a lot of detail, but is it they're really getting like a layer and then multiple layers of waste underneath? So you're kind of, do you have to estimate that? Is there ways to do that?
I to squish it into 45 minutes, I kind of slightly skipped over what we might call a large waste pile.
Sure.
And then at the time, folk were, it's kind of even more dangerous, kind of with the pandemic and everything. Yeah. So the idea of getting people to pick weight, it just was ethically not acceptable. So folk would put like a kind of quadrat on top and then count items on a big pile of waste on a quadrat.
Yeah, just thinking about some of the stuff from the early stuff I've seen from some of the people in the Spaces project was using like kind of sort of some drone footage and different things to obviously look at it at one level, and then you've got the on the ground. But it was again this kind of almost like we're underestimating the sort of 3D reality. So you can look and see a large area, surface area, but again the depth sometimes and how far deep it goes down, and those are harder things to perhaps.
They are. We've got essentially kind of estimates on the ground of how deep, how wide do we think this waste is, and a couple of quadrats on top for large waste piles, but I can't slightly skip over it.
I heard in the last meeting of the Spaces project was, it will change the landscape.
Yeah.
Some of these waste piles, it looked very different over the years, and kind of, again, it built up and built up over time, so it was, again, it was, so I kind of underestimating, the reality of the ground level.
Yeah. So there are bits of data that I didn't manage to get into the constraints of the tool.
Any other? Well, this was actually at 2 o'clock, so I think we're going to end it there. So Jim's still around for about another hour or so. If we head back to the train station, so then we'll have a chat with him. He's here in the room, and we'll have time for that. And so I'd like to just thank everyone who attended, teams and the room, and of course for Jim for coming up and getting really interested. Thank you very much, Jim.